Hi, it's Dr. Marks, and our topic for today is, what is free trade? You hear the concept talked about a lot in the news. Economists are always talking about free trade. But what exactly do we mean by free trade? And why do economists love it? Why do some people fear it? Let's get started. So, what is free trade, and why do some fear it? When we talk about trade, trade is the act of countries exchanging goods and services. The act of countries exchanging goods and services. Well, it turns out that all countries are involved in trade. And you might be thinking, no, not all countries. Well, yeah, all countries. Even the most isolated countries participate in some trade. So maybe you're thinking North Korea. They're completely isolationist. North Korea doesn't trade with anyone. But that's not true. For example, North Korea trades for energy with China. And another country that's been reasonably isolationist is Burma. But Burma, now called Myanmar, has been trading timber to Japan. So all countries are involved in trade, some at greater levels than others, but there's no country in the world that has no trade at all. Free trade refers to trade in the absence of trade barriers. So free trade is trade in the absence of trade barriers. This means that goods and services can flow freely between countries without restrictions. So goods and services can flow freely between countries without any restrictions that would limit them or keep them out. The United States is involved in free trade with certain countries, actually a lot of countries. For example, NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. And you've probably heard of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Well, NAFTA allows goods to flow between the United States, Canada, and Mexico without restrictions. The idea is to maximize trade opportunities. And so when there's no barriers and the United States, Canada, and Mexico can trade with each other without any restrictions, then it's going to create even more trade opportunities. Now, there's other agreements that the United States is involved in. It's involved in CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, as well. The idea is that it should make everyone better off, because you have access to other countries' markets without any kinds of limitations. Now, how do economists feel about the idea of free trade? Well, economists are overwhelmingly in favor of free trade. In fact, studies show that more than 98% of economists agree that free trade is good. So, overwhelming support from economists in favor of free trade. And you have to remember that economists are not in the habit of agreeing. In fact, it's kind of a running joke in our profession that you can get 100 economists in a room and still not reach any kind of conclusion, that they'll never agree. So, the fact that economists agree on this idea of free trade suggests that economic theory is clear. Free trade is good. And of course, free trade maximizes trading opportunities. And so when trading opportunities are maximized, that's going to be good as well. Should lead to increased standards of living. The idea of free trade is based on Adam Smith's philosophy. And it comes from The Wealth of Nations, written in the 18th century. So Adam Smith is considered to be the father of modern economic thought. So think about it. Adam Smith, who wrote in the 18th century, we still refer to him as being really the father of modern economic thought. So really, the philosophy that we teach in our economics classes has its roots all the way back to Adam Smith in the 18th century, and that's really incredible. Well, Adam Smith states, "It is the maxim of every prudent master of a family never to attempt to make at home what it will cost him more to make than to buy." All right, so that's a little mouthful. It's written a little formally. So it's the maxim of every prudent master of a family. All right, we can kind of ignore that part. Let's focus on the rest. Never to attempt to make at home what it will cost him more to make than to buy. Well, you and I operate this same way. For example, most of us don't make all of our own clothes, and most of us don't grow all of our own food. Instead, we go to Walmart. And when we go to Walmart, we're trading. So go back to Adam Smith's principle, never attempt to make at home what it will cost more to make than to buy. Well, I'm thinking about me trying to make all of my own clothes. Well, I'm not going to be very good at it, and when I factor in my time, it's certainly going to be an incredibly expensive endeavor. It just makes more sense for me to go to a store and get it. Now, I can bake bread, but I find myself going to Walmart and grabbing their $1 loaf of French bread, right? I've got 2 teenage boys. That's like a savior on my dinner table because they eat like horses. For $1, I couldn't possibly make my own bread, especially when I factor in my time. So I'm choosing to buy things that would cost me more to make at home than to buy. All right, you get the idea. So really what we're saying is that you should focus on what you do best and trade for the rest. Now remember, when I'm going to Walmart and buying that $1 loaf of French bread, I am indeed trading. So we're not just talking about barter trade here. Adam Smith was responding to the philosophy of the mercantilists. Now, the mercantilists believed in exports because it brought in revenue. Well, that makes sense. So Adam Smith is really just responding to the philosophy of the mercantilists who are focusing on exports because it brought in revenue. Now, that revenue that was brought in from exports could be used to buy gold. But here's the concern. While this makes sense, right? Exports bring in revenue. The mercantilists did not support the idea of imports. So they didn't like imports because imports had to be paid for. And so, according to the mercantilists, imports were bad because it meant money was leaving the country. And if money is leaving the country, then it meant less gold could be purchased. So the mercantilist philosophy was exports are good, imports are bad, right? But this philosophy is really outdated. We know now, and economists support, that imports are good, just like exports are good. So just because we're importing something and money is leaving the country, that's not a bad thing. And we'll be learning a lot more about this idea of imports versus exports. But the idea is that this philosophy is outdated. However, there are still policymakers who are skeptical of trade and specifically skeptical of imports. Most people agree exports are good, but there's a lot of people that say imports are bad. In fact, right now as I record this, 2016, we're in an election campaign period. And you're hearing a lot of rhetoric about, oh, we're importing too much from China and we need to stop that. Economists aren't going to agree with that statement, but that's a topic for another day. So what are the advantages of trade? Well, to explain the advantages of trade, let's go back to our example with NAFTA. Again, NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. Under NAFTA, The U.S. can sell cars to Mexico without any barriers in place, without any restrictions, without any special taxes. So, when there's no barriers in place, the price will be cheaper. So, NAFTA allows the United States to sell cars to Mexico at a lower price than if trade barriers existed. Well, let's think about how that affects Mexico. This means Mexico will buy more of our cars. Well, if Mexico buys more of our cars because they're cheaper, that means more money for the United States. And that's a good thing. But there's also benefits to Mexico. Let's focus from Mexico's perspective. They can buy those American cars cheaper than they could buy cars from, let's say, Europe, where maybe trade barriers are in place. So because they're part of NAFTA, they have access to cheaper cars than they can get from some of the other places in the world that sell cars. When Mexican citizens can buy cars more cheaply, they benefit. But Mexico can also sell their goods to the United States without barriers. Again, that's part of being in NAFTA. So that means that the goods they sell are cheaper. And if Mexico's selling cheaper goods, then the United States will buy more. And of course, this benefits Mexico. But we also should note this benefits the United States as well, right? It's not just a benefit to Mexico. The United States is able to buy goods from Mexico more cheaply than they would have before NAFTA. So, let's summarize. In summary, the United States can sell more goods to Mexico, and it can buy Mexican goods more cheaply. So we have to understand that we win when we sell the goods in Mexico, but we also win when we buy the goods from Mexico. Mexico can sell more goods to the United States, and that's good for Mexico, but it also can buy American goods more cheaply. That's also good for Mexico. And we haven't even mentioned Canada at this point. So we could expand to talk about all these same benefits between US and Canada and Mexico and Canada. You get the idea. The bottom line is that both countries are better off and their economies will prosper. There's also an added benefit to the United States. Now we have to admit, this is one that may go well into the future. But trade helps developing economies grow. Now, do we all agree? We have an incentive in the United States to want Mexico's economy to grow. We want Mexico to get richer. Remember, as the economies grow, as Mexico's economies grow, the standards of living will increase. And that means incomes are increasing. Now, why would the United States care about this? Well, if standard of living increases substantially in Mexico, then illegal immigration is going to fall. Again, not saying that this is happening immediately, but we have a vested interest in Mexico's standard of living go up. There's lots of different reasons we could argue that we want to see economic growth in Mexico. And if NAFTA helps that, then it's certainly something we would support. Economists know that developing countries need to be involved in trade. In fact, it's very important for prosperity, this idea of access to global markets. So economists know that developing countries need to be involved in trade. But the good news is that it doesn't have to be a sophisticated good that's being traded. It just needs to be something that the country has a comparative advantage in. So again, you don't have to have a super sophisticated good to be involved in trade. It just needs to be something for which your country has a comparative advantage. For a poorer developing country, it might be something that's very labor intensive, right? That makes sense. In the poor developing world, they tend to produce products that are very labor intensive. For example, it could be agricultural products. It could be things like clothing. And given the expensive labor in the industrialized world, they may not face as much competition from richer nations, right? I mean, does the United States produce a lot of clothing? No, we don't. We leave that, for the most part, to the developing nations of the world. We produce some clothing, but certainly not enough. So we import a lot of clothing. Think about it. Our labor is very expensive in the United States. So it makes sense for these products to be produced where labor is a lot cheaper. So let's think about the case of Thailand. Now, Thailand is a country I visit every year. It's one of my favorite countries in the world. I lead a study abroad program there. Well, Thailand specializes in rice. And as you can see, it's very labor intensive. This right here is a picture of rice farmers in Thailand, and it's really something that for the most part is done by hand. But what do we know about Thailand? Labor is very cheap in Thailand. We also know that rice production is very water intensive. So Thailand has a significant rainy season that makes it a good place to grow rice. Of course, in the United States, we don't produce as much rice. We don't really have a climate that's perfect for rice. But in Thailand, they can take advantage of that rainy season and flood their rice paddies. Now, Thailand produces very high quality rice, and they sell it all over the world. So Thailand definitely is a big exporter of rice. Is it a super sophisticated product or fancy product? No. But it's one for which they have a comparative advantage. Thailand even grows rice in the mountains. So what you're seeing right now are terraced rice fields in northern Thailand where you start seeing a lot of mountains. Again, imagine how much work it would take to build these terraces into the side of the mountains, but they are very productive, and it's absolutely beautiful. So let's take a look at Thailand. What we know is that Thailand has been the #1 producer and exporter of rice. So if you look at the graphic on the left, you see Thailand in blue, and for years 2009, 10, 11, and 12, they have been the #1 producer of rice, although they definitely face some competition. Now, I will share with you that they've actually lost this status as being the largest exporter of rice because of some weird governmental subsidy scheme that backfired on them. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically Thailand's government officials during an election, somebody promised farmers these huge subsidies for rice. That was their way of buying votes in the rural areas where the farmers live. Well, they won the election, they implemented the rice subsidy scheme, and it has backfired. It has devastated the rice industry. So Thailand certainly has the productive capability of being the #1 exporter of rice, but government interference to these crazy programs that backfired, well, now they're #2. I believe it's Vietnam that has moved to #1, but don't quote me on that. So right here, we're looking at importers and exporters of rice. take a look at the right-hand side where it's orange, and you see in 2008, Thailand is the #1 exporter of rice. Vietnam is #2, but look who's #3. United States. So we do produce a lot of rice, but we unfortunately don't have that great rainy season to take advantage of like they do in Southeast Asia. But we're still productive in rice. If you look on the other side in green, you see importers of rice. So Thailand has been, as I said, until recently, and I'm recording this in 2016, so until just recently, they were the #1 producer of rice. But as I said, that government scheme to buy votes and offer subsidies to rice farmers backfired on them, and now they can't pay the bills for this rice subsidy scheme, and everything's going crazy. But that's a story for another day. Now, Thailand, even though it's a small country, has extensive free trade agreement networks. So what that tells us is that Thailand participates in several trade agreements, and a bunch of them are listed there. We don't need to go into all of them, but the point is that this gives Thailand access to lots of other markets. And please understand, while I'm using Thailand as an example, this is not unique to Thailand. You've got your small countries of Central America. They've gotten together and created a free trade agreement. African nations have formed free trade agreements. We're seeing free trade agreements all over the globe, and it's not just for the industrialized nations. We're used to thinking of NAFTA and the European Union, but there's a whole bunch of other trade agreements that you're probably not familiar with. So the bottom line is, you don't have to be a big country, you don't have to be a rich country, you just have to be a country that has a comparative advantage in something that you can then export. And you need to find ways to access the global marketplace, and trade agreements are some ways of doing that. That offers opportunities for free trade with a bunch of other countries. So again, another look at this idea of the different trade agreements that have been signed, and you see all these different connections between little bitty Thailand and lots of different countries. So we're not going to get too far into this, but just know that Thailand has done a very good job connecting itself to other countries' markets through trade agreements. What does the data show us? Well, this is exports for Thailand, and we see that they have continuously gone up. Now, we see a couple blips, right? And those blips, 2009, we see a downturn. Remember what happened in 2008, 2009? We have the financial crisis. And in the most recent period of time, we've got this weird problem with rice with these, as I was telling you about, subsidy programs that are backfiring. And so exports of rice are falling, and that is definitely driving down Thai's exports. But generally, we've seen an upward trend, and hopefully after they figure their way through this weird rice subsidy scheme, they can get back on track. Well, if I look right here, this graph shows in blue exports and in black imports. So remember, the mercantilists said, hey, exports are good, but imports are bad. Well, this data seems to suggest otherwise, right? Basically, exports and imports seem to be correlated, at least for Thailand, right? So basically what that's telling us is, as Thailand exports more, they bring in money. Well, what can they do with this money? They can demand products from other countries. There's nothing wrong with that. The fact that imports are going up suggests that Thailand's getting richer. A lot of people want to think about increasing imports as a sign that somehow a country's not productive. And that can be the case. It could be the case that a country is not productive in the global market, so they have to import more. But that's not what's going on in Thailand. So everyone who's so scared of imports really is missing the point of the story. And again, that story is that increasing exports brings more money into your country and gives you the luxury of being able to demand more foreign products. On this graph, in blue, we have Thailand's exports, and in black, we have Thailand's gross domestic product per capita in purchasing power parity. So we see that exports are increasing and GDP per capita is also increasing. So Thailand's income is going up on a per person basis, standards of living are going up, exports are going up, and if I was able to put imports here, we would see that imports are going up. So they're importing more, but they're also becoming a country with a higher standard of living. So imports are not the kiss of death that some people want to make them out to be. Now, what about the United States? Let's take a look. Over time, we are seeing average tariffs falling. So what we're right here, let's take a look at what we're looking at. So in yellow, we have the average tariff on our imports. In purple, we have GDP per capita, which is our proxy for income per person. In pink, we have total trade as a percentage of GDP. And in green, we have average tariffs on imports. So what this tells us, first, is that over time, we see average tariffs falling. So take a look at the yellow. Tariffs are coming down, which means trade is becoming more open. So markets are becoming more accessible. And we see that total trade is on the rise. How do I see that? I see that in the pink line. Total trade as a percentage of GDP is on the rise. So we're seeing more trade. So America is seeing an increase in trade as a percent of its gross domestic product. At the same time, GDP per capita is on the rise. So income per capita, per person, our proxy for that, is going up, which means standard of living is on the rise. So the bottom line is it's not clear at all that we would enjoy the same results if we had a closed economy. Unfortunately, there are some people that think we need to have a more closed economy, that we need less trade rather than more trade. But the data doesn't really suggest that that would be the way to go. Let's talk about restricted trade. While there are a lot of free trade agreements, as we've already talked about, we unfortunately do not see global free trade. So again, make sure you're clear. We see pockets of free trade. So we've got NAFTA, we've got EU, we've got ASEAN, we've got CAFTA. So we've got all these little areas that have developed free trade agreements, but we don't have a global free trade agreement where all countries can trade with each other without barriers. So countries have free trade with some nations, but then they have restricted trade with other nations. And that explains the United States, right? We have free trade with some nations, but then we have restricted trade with a whole lot of other nations. Now, restricted trade involves the use of trade barriers. What do I mean by a trade barrier? Things that limit trade. So the most common trade barriers are quotas and tariffs. So let's move on to explain the ideas of quotas and tariffs. A quota is a limit on the number of units that can be exported. A limit on the number of units that can be exported. For example, the United States has a quota in place on the amount of foreign sugar that can enter our country. So if you want to send sugar to the United States, you have to have a share of this quota that's put in place. Tariffs are taxes that are placed on the foreign product. So taxes are placed on the imports. For example, the United States imposes tariffs on clothing and textiles, things like fabrics, that enter our country. So we have quotas on sugar and we have tariffs on clothing. Now, in some cases, countries impose embargoes. An embargo is an outright trade barrier with trade simply being suspended. In other words, it means we won't trade at all. Usually, an embargo is in place because we don't support a government. For example, the United States has had an embargo on Cuba. That's changed in the recent years. But we still have an embargo right now in 2016 on Burma, which is also called Myanmar. We're going to leave our discussion of trade barriers for another unit, but you're going to become intimately knowledgeable about the economic impacts when we impose quotas and when we impose tariffs. So let's summarize. Economists are overwhelmingly in favor of free trade. Developing nations can benefit greatly by having access to the global marketplace. But developed nations like the United States also benefit when they can buy goods and services from others at lower prices. So understand that when the United States participates in free trade agreements, it's not the other country that gets all the benefits. And I think a lot of people think that way. A lot of people think that Mexico gets all the benefits. But we actually get benefits when we can buy Mexican products and Canadian products at lower prices. The United States also benefits when other countries can buy its goods without these quotas and tariffs. So again, Mexico and Canada are going to buy more from us because they can buy our goods without quotas and tariffs in place. There are many free trade agreements between nations, too many for me to go into and list. But there's no single country that practices solely free trade. Every country has some trade barriers in place with some countries that they operate with. Trade barriers are used to limit the flow of foreign products. So I gave you the example of having the United States having quotas on sugar and tariffs on textiles. So obviously we do that to limit the flow of foreign sugar into our country and limit the flow of foreign textiles into our country. Of course, when we put trade barriers in place, it makes the prices of those foreign products higher. Well, this can protect the domestic industry, right? So think about it. When we put taxes on Toyotas that are made in Japan, it helps car manufacturers like Ford sell more cars in the United States. It shields them from a little bit of competition. But as you're going to learn, society is really better off with free trade. And that's what a lot of people are confused about. A lot of people really think that we're better off if we have restricted trade. You'll also learn that there are winners and losers with free trade. And it's important for us to think about that. I'm not trying to say that free trade benefits absolutely everybody, but society wins. The sugar farmer in the United States definitely will not benefit if we open our market to an unlimited amount of cheap foreign sugar. So we want to understand that if we say, hey, let's have free trade in sugar, sugar farmers in the United States will be hurt. And that's what a lot of people focus on. People who are against free trade would say, hey, it's going to cost jobs for sugar farmers. And I'm not disputing that. But what they forget is that consumers benefit. And they also forget that so do producers who use sugar. They're also going to benefit. And so a lot of times people who are opposed to free trade focus on just one part of the story and they forget the other part of the story. If we require everyone to win, then true, it would be very difficult for us to support free trade. So again, if our litmus test is there can be no losers, yeah, we would never implement free trade. However, if we look at the big picture, and that's what economists do, we see that economies are made better off with free trade. Now, we're going to learn a great deal about the debate surrounding trade as we progress through this course. So for now, we'll leave it at this, and we'll plan to expand on all of these topics. Of course, if you have any questions, please let me know. And thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great day.